whole book is out now?
No, the book will be out next week, I think.
Oh.
It's just that we have the cover. Let me tell you that we are live on YouTube, just in case. So David is going first, Andrea is going second. Yeah.
I think Andrea was going to go. I think Andrea might go first. And about the handout, what I did, I think this will work. I created a Google document, and I have a link that I will just paste into the chat box when I do my paper. I think it'll work. My daughter showed me how to do it earlier today, so I think it'll help.
If you paste the link there, it's okay.
Yes.
And then you have kind of one title for the whole session, and questions at the end.
Okay.
Because on the website I didn't find. So do you have individual titles for each papers that are not on the website? That's what I'm asking. If I have to moderate.
Do we?
Or it's just one title with two talks addressing the same title.
Something like that. Is that right, David?
I eventually came up with a title, but it's just Descartes' rational distinction and the omnibenevolence of God, but it just treats the issue of rational distinction. Yeah.
All right.
Right. Okay. Well, I guess mine will be then Descartes on the non-identity of divine attributes and infinite substance.
Can you say it again?
Descartes on the non-identity of divine attributes and infinite substance. Marilyn, nice to see you.
Right. So shall we wait for one more minute and admit more people, and then we can begin?
I think we can wait even 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay.
So we're just about right on time.
Right. Perhaps we should begin.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much to the organizers for these seminars and for selecting our proposals. It is a great pleasure to be here.
Let me just, Andrea, let me just introduce the seminar first and say,
okay, sorry.
And announce that our meeting tonight has the common title Divine Attributes and Infinite Substance in Descartes. We will have 2 papers with questions at the end. Our first speaker is Andrea Christophidou from the University of Oxford with a talk on Descartes on the non-identity of divine attributes and infinite substance. Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Descartes' metaphysics of divine attributes and infinite substance is complex and controversial. My concern is with the attribution to Descartes of a commitment to the identity of divine attributes and infinite substance, henceforth the identity thesis or the controversy. The central question of my paper is Descartes committed or even ought to be committed to the identity thesis? Could he be so committed without vitiating his entire metaphysics? In addressing this question, I draw both on textual and philosophical evidence and argue that any solution to the controversy has 2 requirements. First, we need a clear grasp of the relation between, the distinction between, and status of substance and attribute, which rests upon a clear understanding of a set of interconnected principles. The principle of ontological status, the principle of categories, and one of Descartes' most important principles, the principle of degrees of reality or perfection. Secondly, we need a clear understanding of Descartes' rational distinction. Once I have addressed these issues, I turn to consider some possible objections to my critique of the identity thesis and offer some replies. The ontological categories in Descartes' metaphysics consist of two distinct kinds of entity, complete and incomplete. The notion of category denotes a principal ordering of what there is in terms of the primary question, what is it? What kind of being is it? And it has two inseparable parts. What its ontological status is, the principle of ontological status, which is reflected in the categorical distinction between independent, dependent, prior, posterior, complete, incomplete. And secondly, what its metaphysical nature is, the principle of categories, which is reflected in the metaphysically distinct nature of entities. The category of complete entities consists of substance, which in turn consists of two fundamentally distinct kinds, infinite substance and finite substance, or in the secondary sense. The category of incomplete entities consists of attributes, which in turn consist of two fundamentally distinct kinds, infinite attributes, of which there is an infinity, and finite attributes, of which there are only two kinds, thought and extension. There is also the category of modes, which pertains only to finite substances. Central to resolving the controversy is, it seems to me, the principle of degrees of reality or perfection. Excuse me. Yet it is almost invariably neglected in this area. An elucidation is therefore crucial. Perfection, as a mass noun, from its Latin etymology perfectionem, from perfectus, means completeness. Thus, perfection denotes degrees of power and independence. Reality, not to be confused with existence, denotes degrees of formal or actual reality of being a true entity possesses in itself. Perfection, as a count noun, means attribute, not ordinary property. All the perfections which I attribute to God, or these perfections, perfectiones, are merely attributes of a substance, proposition 3. Thus, first, by the principle of degrees of reality or perfection, the infinite substance is supremely perfect, that is, supremely complete, supremely independent, supremely powerful, supremely real, third meditation. Secondly, by this principle, the more reality a substance has, the more perfections or attributes it has. The infinite substance is supremely real, thereby has an infinity of infinite, true, and real attributes or perfections, as Descartes makes clear in Axiom 6 and throughout his work. Substance. First, the independence thesis, which is expressed both in the meditations and in the principles. Third meditation. By the word God, I understand a substance that is infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful. Principles 151. By substance, we can understand nothing other than a thing which exists in such a way as to depend on no other thing for its existence. And there is only one substance which we can understand to depend on no other thing whatsoever, namely God. The infinite substance is in itself and is conceived through itself. It is ontologically, metaphysically, and explanatorily supremely independent. There is at least and at most one true, infinite, supremely real or perfect substance, the ultimate fundamental reality, God, definition 8. Secondly, the subject thesis. In his letter to Clesariel, Descartes writes, "By infinite substance, I mean a substance which has actually infinite and immense true and real perfections. This is not an accident added to the notion of substance, but the very essence of substance, taken absolutely and bounded by no defects." This is crucial, because what Descartes is conveying here is that attributes are not accidents or properties added to or predicated of substance. Rather, they are what constitutes the essence of substance. The independence thesis, both in the Meditations and in the Principles, and the subject thesis, are consistent and reciprocal conceptions of the same ontological category, the infinite substance. Moreover, they express and enable us to understand what it is to be substance, and which substance it is, what its nature is. Furthermore, the two theses explain why the notion of substance does not apply univocally to God and to anything else, Principles 151. For anything else, by the principle of degrees of reality or perfection, has a lower degree of reality, power, and independence. And I should add here that the same goes for attributes and essence. Attributes, Principle 153 and 156. Attributes, infinite or finite, are real, true, incomplete entities. Being incomplete does not entail that attributes have no correlating reality. It entails that they have no independence. Attributes have a degree of intrinsic, formal, or actual reality or being. But no infinite attribute is supremely infinite, only infinite in its kind. Spinoza states this clearly in Ethics 1, definition 6, explanation, and in 1, proposition 16, demonstration. He writes, "Each of the attributes expresses an essence infinite in its kind. Infinite attributes reside in or inhere in the supremely infinite substance. The supremely infinite substance does not and cannot inhere in anything. Attributes, infinite or finite, are not ordinary properties or accidents or features or conceptual or linguistic terms or aspects or ways of seeing pertaining to our intellect. Rather, they are what constitute and express, that is, make known, the essence of their respective substances." Principles 153. Drawing on the relation between, distinction between, and status of the two kinds of entity leads me to Descartes' third or general thesis of substance, which is stated in definition 5. Substance. This term applies to everything in which whatever we perceive immediately resides as in a subject, or to everything by means of which whatever we perceive exists. For we know by the natural light that a real attribute cannot belong to nothing. 2 points. There are 2 points regarding this general conception of substance. First, on this conception, we can understand what it is to be substance, but on this basis alone, we cannot understand which substance it is. We can clearly and distinctly understand which substance it is only under its inseparable principal attribute or attributes. Attributes make known the essence of substance as being thus and so. In understanding which substance it is not our reason that makes it thus and so. Rather, we understand the fundamental ground of difference of that substance as distinct from another. Understanding which substance it is cannot leave the question open as to what its nature is. This seems to me to be what Descartes' empiric objectors didn't seem to grasp. Secondly, what is conveyed by the general conception of substance is that the notions of inhering, residing, contained in denote a dependence inseparability relation, not a container relation. Substance is not an amphora, nor is it a featureless substratum that supports accidents or properties that we happen to ascribe to it. The technical sense of the little word in denotes a relation of priority or independence as in itself or in se, or ontological posteriority or dependence as in another, in alio, not spatial and not causal. By mediated in this context, Descartes means inseparably, such that an attribute is inseparable from substance. Residing means it is dependent on substance. Thus, as definition 5 states, by whatever we perceive immediately resides as in a subject, is meant any intrinsic property, quality, or attribute of which we have a real idea. And the real idea is a true idea. Contained in can also mean it is true of that thing. Definition 9 and proposition 1 demonstration. What's important is that none of these notions denotes identity. Substance is always a subject, not an attribute. An attribute is always in a subject and never a substance. A fortiori, no substance can be identical with attributes, and vice versa. Yet Nelson, following Nolan, endorses what he calls the strict numerical identity of attributes and substance in rings, and argues that substance is not a fundamental category in metaphysics. Rather, he says, the concept of substance is itself regarded as an attribute of independently existing entities. I find this rather puzzling. First, by whom is it so regarded? Clearly not by Descartes, as demonstrated above, and presumably not by Aristotle, Spinoza, Leibniz, or even Kant. Secondly, if substance is an attribute, what exactly are those independently existing entities? They must be substances, because substances are the only entities that can exist independently. 6 set of replies. But then why isn't that concept of substance an attribute of independently existing entities? And so on ad infinitum. On Nelson's account, the concept infinite substance, that is the concept God, must be an attribute of an independently existing entity. But that seems to me incoherent. Pulling together my discussion so far, the identity thesis is demonstrated to be inconsistent with Descartes' metaphysics of substance and attribute and with his principles. I turn now to consider the rational distinction. I use rational rather than conceptual distinction. In Principles 160, Descartes states that there are 3 sorts of distinction: a real distinction, a modal distinction, or a rational distinction, and proceeds to explain each in 3 consecutive articles. Since it is the rational which is relevant here, I shall not discuss the other 2. Principles 162 states, the rational distinction is a distinction between a substance and some attribute of that substance, without which the substance is unintelligible. Alternatively, It is a distinction between two such attributes of a single substance. Such a distinction is recognized by our inability to form a clear and distinct idea of the substance if we exclude from it the attribute in question. It is clear that for Descartes, a rational distinction is not drawn by our reason. If it were, we wouldn't have the problems that he clearly spells out. Our inability is not psychological or epistemic. The direction is the other way. We recognize that there is a rational distinction founded in reality. In other words, the source of the distinction is in the entities themselves, not in our reason. Nelson, following Noland, however, insists that for Descartes, a conceptual distinction is drawn only in reason, not in things, not in reality. This is odd, because Descartes explicitly states, I do not recognize any distinction made by reason, ratiocinatis, letter to anonymous correspondent. The only rational distinction Descartes accepts and uses is a distinction with a foundation in reality, a distinction recognized by reason. Now, both kinds of distinction can be called rational, but the important difference lies in the nature of each. A distinction ratiocinatis is a product of reason without foundation in reality, whereas a distinction ratiocinate is founded in reality and recognized by our reason. Nelson's and Noland's insistence on the first distinction seems to me is devoid of cogency. Kaufmann in turn states, unfortunately, Descartes does not explain what he means by a conceptual distinction, having a foundation or lacking one. Again, this is odd. Descartes does explain what he means and why he only recognizes a distinction founded in reality. He writes, I do not recognize any distinction made by reason ratiocinatis, one which has no foundation in reality, because we cannot have any true thought without a foundation. And consequently, in that article, Principles 162, I did not add the term ratiocinate, again, letter to the anonymous correspondent. Descartes did not add ratiocinate, not because he was confused about the distinction, as it has been claimed, but because it couldn't be anything other than one founded in reality. Since for Descartes, any true thought we can have must be founded in something real. Whatever is true is something, fifth meditation. Truth consists in being, in what is real, letter to Mersenne, the intrinsic denomination of truth, somehow missed by the defenders of the identity thesis. The distinction is not made by our reason. For Descartes, the direction is the other way. Our reason recognizes a distinction founded in the entities themselves. Our mind, he says, is not the measure of reality or of truth, but certainly it should be the measure of what we assert or deny. Letter to More, implying epistemic responsibility. In fact, contrary to the identity thesis, Descartes argues that all three kinds of distinction, real, modal, and rational, can all be called real, because they're all founded in reality. Letter to anonymous correspondent. The confusion in this area, it seems to me, is that if a distinction of reason ratiocinate is founded in reality, it means somehow it is a real distinction, which implies dualism. But that's a mistake, it seems to me, because the two distinctions are different in their commitments. So what does having a foundation in reality mean? In answer to Kaufmann's criticism, by foundation in reality, Descartes means that the determinacy and necessity of the three distinctions are part of the order and structure of reality, of what is real and true. The distinction ratiocinate is founded in the attributes themselves and between them and the infinite substance. But it is not only the distinction ratiocinate within the divine attributes and their non-identity, which is important, but also their unity. They jointly constitute the essence of God. These perfections exist in God and are joined together not by any fiction of the intellect, but by their very nature. First set of replies. Paraphrasing slightly, sixth set of replies. That which is omniscient and that which is omnipotent are one and the same in virtue of a unity of nature. In other words, it is God or its essence which is one and the same, not the attributes. The unity and inseparability of the divine attributes is entailed by the supreme reality within the true unity and simplicity of God. There is unity in plurality, Leibniz states. God's simplicity denotes inseparability, true unity, or indivision in all its attributes. Being simple does not entail being devoid of inseparable attributes, nor does it reduce to identity. A substance with no attributes contradicts the notion of substance. As Leibniz argues, simple substances, monadology 1, must have some attributes, otherwise there would not be beings at all, monadology 8. God is monas monadum, the supreme monad, the supreme substance, monadology 38 to 55, and must contain as much reality as possible, monadology 40. Leibniz clearly draws on Descartes' principle of degrees of reality or perfection. Spinoza also draws on Descartes' principle. See, for example, Ethics 1, proposition 9, leading to, in proposition 15, the identification of absolute substance and God. Aristotle states, by inner subject, what I mean what is in something not as a part in his categories. And finally, Descartes states, the unity, the simplicity, the inseparability of all the attributes of God is one of the most important of the perfections, which I understand him to have. Third meditation. How could he say it is one of the most important of the perfections if all the perfections were identical and in turn identical with God? There is an unmistakable reciprocal link between unity, indivisibility, simplicity, inseparability. Pulling together the discussion so far, an interim conclusion follows. The identity thesis is inconsistent with Descartes' metaphysics. It is in fact untenable. I say interim conclusion because prima facie there are some passages that seemingly form a basis for objections against my account. I aim to consider at least two for this seminar, but given the time constraint, I shall go straight to the second one, if that's okay. So this is what would have been the second passage. It's Principles 163, I'm sure a very familiar principle in this area, in this discussion, which states, thought and extension can be regarded as constituting the natures of intelligent substance and corporeal substance. They must then be considered as nothing else but thinking substance itself and extended substance itself, that is mind and body. In this way, we will have a very clear and distinct understanding of them. Objection. Kaufmann draws on this passage and argues, the only text in which Descartes claims an identity between substance and an attribute concern only the principal attributes of thought and extension and the attributes of God. Replies. It would be hasty, it seems to me, to conclude with Kaufmann that, for example, body and its extension are really identical. There are at least 4 possible explanations of Principles 163. First, Descartes clearly states that thought and extension can be regarded as constituting the natures of their respective substances, not are identical with the substances. He's concerned with our understanding of the 2 attributes and suggests that they must be considered as, not are, nothing else. Secondly, and importantly, Descartes abandoned the Aristotelian conception of substance as a composite. In his arduous attempt to convince the staunch Aristotelians of his new metaphysics and enable them to understand it, he stresses that attributes be considered as nothing else, that is, as not Aristotelian substantial forms, and consequently, substance is not a composite of matter and form. Thirdly, Descartes stresses that, contrary to his empiric objectors, substance is neither a featureless substratum nor a bare prime matter to which we ascribe accidents or properties. Fourthly, Descartes is conveying his new thesis that finite attribute, and I suggest as well as finite substance and finite essence, is a simple common notion attributed indifferently to corporeal and thinking substances. Simple common notions relate to many things an idea which is itself singular, that is, whose referent is a singular true nature, letter to regis. This is in opposition to what he calls the dialectician's universals, which he abandoned, and revised the order of reasoning, 5th set of replies and Principles 159. Descartes' distinction ratiocinate between substance and attribute implies no identity. I turn now to Kaufmann's argument that God and infinite attributes are really identical, even though the concepts are distinct. He rightly rejects Nelson's and Nolan's insistence on the distinction ratiocinatis and instead introduces 2 kinds of distinction ratiocinatis in defense of the identity thesis. The concept God and the concept attribute are distinct concepts, what he calls distinction 1, which enables us to make sense of the statement God has attributes and avoid the nonsensical identity statements God is attributes or attributes are God. But in reality, God and attributes are really identical, what he calls distinction 2, which holds between identicals such as God and its attributes or a body and its extension. On Kaufmann's thesis, although we can carry on making statements such as God has attributes, in fact, we are deluded. The statement is not a genuine true statement. It is in fact false, because in reality, God and attributes are really identical. Let us grant for the sake of argument that on Kaufmann's thesis, the concept God and the concept attribute are co-referential. They refer to one entity, but differ in their Phrygian senses, analogous to the co-referential singular terms Hesperus and Phosphorus, which refer to one entity, the planet Venus, but differ in their senses. On this interpretation, God and attributes are identical. they have the same identical true essence. A necessary condition of identity is Leibniz's law. If A is identical to B, then whatever is true of A is true of B. This principle states that indiscernibility is a necessary condition of identity. If God and divine attributes are identical, then whatever is true of God is true of divine attributes. 2. God and divine attributes are two discernible, distinct kinds of entity, complete and incomplete. Thus, 3. Whatever is true of God is not true of divine attributes. Ergo, God, or supremely infinite substance, and divine attributes are not identical. But in fact, this analysis is irrelevant because the relation between substance and attribute is not a relation of identity. In the case of the planet Venus, there is only one ontologically indiscernible entity and two singular terms. In the case of God and attributes, there are two discernible kinds of entity. I conclude with some brief comments on discernibility. Logically, the term God and the term attribute are discernible not only in their Phrygian sense, but also in their reference. The entity referred to by the term God is not the entity referred to by the term attribute. Metaphysically, God and attributes are discernible in their different degrees of reality or perfection. One is supremely perfect and real, the other is perfect and real only in its kind. Ontologically, God and attributes are discernible in their status, in what they are. One is a complete independent entity, the other is an incomplete dependent entity. In answer to the central question of my paper, God is neither committed nor ought to be committed to the identity thesis. He writes, "It is a conceptual contradiction to suppose that two things, which we clearly perceive as different, should become one and the same, that is intrinsically one and the same." 6th set of replies. It is therefore fallacious to argue that two things, which are logically, metaphysically, ontologically discernible, are one and the same entity. God and attributes are inseparable, but not identical. The identity thesis in general, and Kaufmann's defense of it in particular, violate not only the principle of the indiscernibility of identicals, but the principle of degrees of reality of perfection, the principle of ontological status, the principle of categories. They violate not only the axiom, whatever is either in itself or in another, but the entire metaphysics of ontological categories and the nature and intelligibility of reality. Thank you. So, overrun.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. I propose we move to the next talk, and then we have questions and answers at the end. So our next speaker is David Cunning, and his talk is called Descartes' Rational Distinction and the Benevolence of God. David, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and put into the chat a link to a Google Doc if anyone wants to take a look at the passages that I referenced throughout the paper. I don't number them, but you'll be able to tell where we are. A lot of them are the same passages that Andrea had considered also. Okay, thank you very much for being here. Descartes clearly holds that a substance and its attributes are rationally distinct, but there is some debate in the literature about how the notion of a rational distinction is to be analyzed. Here I would like to discuss some concerns that arise for the view that Descartes holds that a substance and its attributes are identical, and then I'll say some things afterwards, of course. There's some textual evidence for the view that Descartes holds that a substance and its attributes are identical. For example, and Andrea had cited this passage, in Principles 163, he writes, "Thought and extension can be regarded as constituting the natures of intelligent substance and corporeal substance. They must then be considered as nothing but thinking substance itself and extended substance itself. Here Descartes is relating, or appears to be relating, that thought is not something that inheres in a substance or is in some sense separate from it. Instead, he says thought just is thinking substance. Similarly, in the letter to the unknown correspondent, 1645 or 1646, Descartes says that the idea of the essence of a triangular body differs from the idea of the existence of a triangular body. The two ideas differ, he says, modally and objectively. But in an actual triangular body, essence and existence are nullo modo distingui, he says. He then deploys another example. When I say Peter is a man, the thought by which I think Peter differs modally from the thought by which I think of man, but in Peter, being a man is nothing other, nihil aliud est, is nothing other than being Peter. In the letter to the unknown correspondent, Descartes appears to be saying that in reality, the essence of a thing is nothing other than the thing, and that a thing and its essence are in no way distinguished. If what it means to say either of these is that they're identical, then Descartes is saying that in reality, a thing and its essence are one and the same. We might worry that the two examples that Descartes provides in the letter to the unknown correspondent are not especially rigorous and that they don't buttress Descartes' case. For example, it's not clear that he takes being a person to be an essence, strictly speaking, and it's not clear that he holds that existing triangles are substances. But there are numerous texts in which Descartes endorses the use of examples that are not fully rigorous, but that are still quite clarificatory. To just cite one example, his fourth reply's discussion of spheres as rectilinear figures in praise of Archimedes. I think that Descartes' own example of the rational distinction between the attributes of a triangular figure is indeed quite helpful, even if it's imprecise. If I consider an existing triangle to be a substance, and I think of its three-angledness and its three-sidedness, I myself am hard-pressed to come up with any way to distinguish the two. There's textual evidence for the view that Descartes holds that a substance and its attributes are identical in reality, but there's also textual evidence against the view that Descartes holds that a substance and its attributes are identical in reality. For example, in second replies, in the More Geometrico, he says that it is a greater thing to preserve or create a substance than to create or preserve the attributes of that substance. Here, Descartes is clearly suggesting that a substance and its attributes are on a different ontological plane if the one requires more labor to create or preserve than the other. And Andrea cited many other pieces of text from second replies in the More Geometrico. Another piece of textual evidence against the view that Descartes holds that a substance and its attributes are identical in reality is in the third meditation, when he claims that the unity, simplicity, and inseparability of all the attributes of God is one of the most important of the perfections, which I understand him to have. And then in the very next sentence, he references not only the inseparability of the divine attributes, but also their interconnectedness. If the divine attributes are interconnected, then they would appear to be different entities in some sense, and different entities that are interconnected. Of course, there are different ways that we might approach these and other pieces of counter evidence for the view that Descartes holds that a substance and its attributes are identical in reality. For example, we might downplay the second replies text, given that it appears in the More Geometrico, and Descartes was extremely resistant to laying out the results of the meditations in a geometrical or synthetic order. But still, he wrote what he did. And even if he was reluctant to write the More Geometrico, he didn't have to include in it claims that he thought were false. Another piece of counter evidence for the view that Descartes holds that a substance and its attributes are identical is his claim in the letter to the unknown correspondent that the rational distinction between a substance and its attributes has a foundation in reality. He writes, I do not recognize any distinction which has no foundation in reality, because we cannot have any thought without a foundation. If the rational distinction between a substance and its attributes has a foundation in reality, then there is something in virtue, there's something in reality in virtue of which a substance and its reality are rationally distinct, and its essence and its attributes are rationally distinct. And so we should draw the conclusion that they are not identical, strictly speaking. Note, however, that some commentators have resisted that conclusion. For example, Alice Sowell, in a 2011 paper, Descartes' reply to Gassendi, how we can know all of God all at once, but still have more to learn about him. Talk about Alice's paper a little bit here. Sowell argues that a substance and its attributes are identical in reality. She cites the evidence for that view. She also holds that for Descartes, the rational distinction between a substance and its attributes has a foundation in reality. She argues that the distinction is grounded in the cognitive operations of finite minds, and finite minds, of course, are part of reality. Sowell argues that the reality that grounds a rational distinction has to be the reality of a finite mind. If the distinction between a substance and its attributes occurs in finite thought alone, that is where we would expect the foundation of a rational distinction to lie, she argues. So I myself find it odd that Descartes would go out of his way to highlight that the rational distinction between a substance and its attributes has a foundation in reality, if all that he means to say is that the distinction is grounded in the cognitive operations of finite minds. The worry is that if a substance and its attributes are in fact identical, then of course the rational distinction between them is grounded in the cognitive operations of finite minds. And I don't see why Descartes would go out of his way to emphasize as much. But more worrisome is that Descartes is clear. Now, Andrea had cited this passage. He's clear in the letter to the unknown correspondent that he recognizes distinctions made by reason, ratios, and nate, but he does not recognize any distinction made by reason, ratios, and nantes, that is one which has no foundation in reality. In the tradition, or at least in the work of nearby contemporaries, the two kinds of distinctions are very different. For example, we find this language in metaphysical disputation, in the metaphysical disputations by Francisco Suarez. Mental distinctions are usually considered to be of two kinds. One which has no foundation in reality is called the distinction of the reasoning reason, distinctio rationis ratiocinantis, because it arises exclusively from the reflection and activity of the intellect. The other, which has a foundation in reality, is called by many a distinction of the reasoned reason, distinctio rationis ratiocinatae. The latter kind of distinction, can be understood as pre-existing in reality prior to the discriminating operation of the mind. A worry is that Descartes says that he does not recognize distinctions of reason, ratios, and nantes, but it would appear that that is exactly the kind of distinction that Descartes is making between a substance and its attributes, if Sowell is right. Sowell focuses in particular on the question of whether or not there is any distinction in reality between God and the divine attributes, which is fitting, given that Descartes is clear that, strictly speaking, only God is a substance. Sowell points to the textual evidence for the view that a substance is identical to its attributes, for example, the letter to the unknown correspondent, and also to the texts that speak to divine simplicity. There's the letter to Mersenne, 27 May 1630, in which Descartes says that in God, willing, creating, and understanding are all the same thing. And those are divine attributes that are all the same thing. There is a letter to Melon, 2 May 1644, in which Descartes says that we should not conceive any precedence or priority between his intellect and will, for the idea which we have of God teaches us that there is in him only a single activity and entirely pure. In God, seeing and willing are one and the same thing. There is the similar language in Principles 123 that God's willing and God's understanding and willing does not happen, as in our case, by means of operations that are in a certain sense distinct from one another. We must rather suppose that there is always a single, identical, and perfectly simple act by means of which he simultaneously understands, wills, and accomplishes everything. There are numerous passages in which Descartes reflects or seems to reflect that omniscience, omnipotence, and the other divine attributes are identical. So Sowell argues that a clear and distinct perception of a divine attribute is not a clear and distinct perception of a feature that inheres in God, or a feature that's inseparable, or a feature that is inseparable from God. Instead, there's no distinction in reality between God and the divine attributes. And to quote from her paper, in the strict sense, there is only one divine attribute. There's only one attribute of God. We have ideas of different attributes of God, and these ideas are modally distinct in the sense of having different objective reality or content, but that content does not track any distinctions in God. Instead, again, to quote from Sowell, the diversity of names for attributes is generated by reference to the confused cognitive roots that lead to the clear and distinct perceptions of God. For example, a finite mind, this is now me summarizing Sowell's view. For example, a finite mind might think about its own finite intellect and then proceed to think about what an intellect would be like if it were infinite. If the circumstances are right, it converges on a clear and distinct idea of God, and it does so by way of the cognitive root of thinking about intellection. It identifies the terminus of its thinking, the clear and distinct idea of God, as an idea of infinite intellect or omniscience. Alternately, a finite mind might initiate its reflections on the nature of God by thinking about its own finite power, and then proceed to think about what a will would be like if it had infinite power. In that case, it arrives at a clear and distinct idea of God by way of the cognitive route of thinking about will, and it identifies the terminus of its thinking as an idea of omnipotence. The terminus of the two cognitive routes is the unitary idea of God. And so the difference between the idea of omniscience and the idea of omnipotence, for example, is just the difference between the two different paths by which we converge on the unitary idea. Sowell accordingly argues that omniscience, omnipotence, and other divine attributes are to be ascribed to God only loosely. She writes, strictly speaking, there is one attribute of God, it is God himself, and loosely speaking, there are many attributes of God. For example, necessary existence, actual infinity, simplicity, independence, substantiality, omnipotence, omniscience. Sowell's view is ingenious, I think. It makes sense of the passages in which Descartes says that in reality, a substance, its attributes are identical. It also makes sense of how our thoughts of omniscience, omnipotence, and other divine attributes would be different, even if such attributes are identical in reality. But Sowell's view still runs into a couple of serious problems. As we have seen, one is that it does not appear to handle Descartes' claim that a rational distinction has a foundation in reality. A second problem is that it posits that for Descartes, divine attributes like omniscience and omnipotence are to be ascribed to God only loosely. There's something that we're thinking when we think omniscience as opposed to omnipotence and vice versa, and that something is more about us and our cognitive processes than it is about God itself. The worry that I have in particular is about the divine attribute of omnibenevolence, an attribute on which God relies heavily throughout his system. For example, he argues that God is good and is not a deceiver, hence that we have no need to worry about the prospect that clear and distinct perceptions might be false. If omnibenevolence is to be ascribed to God only loosely, and if the difference between what we are thinking when we think omnibenevolence as opposed to some other divine attribute is a difference in the cognitive route by which we arrive at a clear and distinct idea of the single attribute that is God, then it is not clear that the conclusion that God is good can do the work that Descartes wants it to do. So I would like to discuss a view that I think any commentator might adopt who holds that for Descartes, a substance and its attributes are identical. Indeed, I think that a commentator might adopt the view also if they hold that for Descartes, a substance and its attributes are not identical. Perhaps I'll just end up making an enemy of most everyone, but basically the idea is this. If a commentator holds that for Descartes, a substance and its attributes are identical, then the goodness that is had by God is a goodness that is identical to omniscience, that is identical to omnipotence, that is identical to supreme independence. That kind of goodness is, for lack of a better word, mind-boggling. Or if a commentator holds that for Descartes, a substance and its attributes are not identical, then the goodness that is had by God is a nihil aliud quam, to use Descartes' language. The goodness that is had by God is nihil aliud quam, but in some way is still not identical to omniscience. And it's also nihil aliud quam omnipotence and nihil aliud quam supreme independence. That kind of goodness is also mind-boggling. I think that Descartes holds that we grasp the truth that God is good, and that in so doing, we are grasping an attribute that does not pertain to God only loosely. We grasp the truth that God is good, but that doesn't mean that we thereby understand the details of the ontology of the goodness of God. Descartes himself nowhere tries to make sense of the ontology of the goodness of God, a goodness that, regardless of how we understand the notion of a rational distinction, is nihil aliud quam omnipotence and omniscience and any other divine attribute. We're not in a position to fully understand the ontology of such a goodness, and Descartes does not pretend to understand it himself. And I have a footnote now here in the paper at this point that I want to mention. It's that Christopher Phillips, who's actually here in the audience at Southern Utah, has a terrific discussion of this kind of view in his 2014 dissertation and in some more recent work. Just wanted to note that. So to say more, Descartes defines truth as the conformity of thought with reality. And he thereby supposes that for every truth, there's some reality or being to which that truth conforms. He writes in a 1639 letter to Mersenne that the word truth, in the strict sense, denotes the conformity of thought with its object, And I included a longer version of the passage there just because I think it's a great passage. Truth is the conformity of thought with reality for Descartes. But just because we grasp a truth, that does not mean that we automatically know the ontology of the being or reality to which that truth conforms. He writes in another letter to Mersenne, you quote as an axiom of mine, whatever we clearly conceive is or exists. That is not at all what I think, for although the objective being of an idea must have a real cause, it is not always necessary that this cause should contain it formally, but only eminently. Descartes says in first replies that it does not admit of any doubt that everything of which I'm clearly and distinctly aware is a true entity. However, he does not think that we can always tell just from inspecting our clear and distinct idea of an entity what that true entity is. We are going to need help in many cases and from something other than the true idea. Descartes writes, for example, that we do not know that material things exist just from having a clear and distinct idea of body. He says, I prove the existence of material things not from the fact that we have ideas of them, but from the fact that these ideas come to us in such a way as to make us aware that they're not produced by ourselves, but come from elsewhere. The epistemic issue that arises when we attempt to identify the truth maker for a true idea of X is that its truth maker might be X itself, but it might be an entity that's more perfect than X, and that contains X only eminently. Sometimes Descartes identifies the truth maker in virtue of which a true idea is true. In some cases, he does not. For example, he identifies a number of eternal truths, like that something cannot come from nothing. But nowhere in his corpus does he make any attempt to provide an account of what it is to which such truths conform. He's silent, and arguably he is silent for good reason. The attempt to converge on the truth maker for the truth that something cannot come from nothing is a mind bender. At least for me. In yet other cases, Descartes identifies the truth maker of a true idea, but he's largely in the dark as to the details of his ontology. Mind-body union is of course one case in point. He says in the Sixth Meditation that he certainly has a body that's very closely joined to me, but he famously holds that we don't understand the ontology of mind-body union or how mind-body union is achieved. But that case isn't an outlier. There are other cases. Another example appears in the Fifth Meditation when Descartes argues that we clearly and distinctly perceive the properties of a triangle and that those properties are therefore quote unquote something. He does not provide any details as to the ontology of this something in the Fifth Meditation, which is to say that he grasps a number of geometrical truths, but he does not yet know exactly how those truths conform to reality. Later in the Sixth Meditation, he argues that geometrical properties exist in material things. He argues that material things exist and that they possess all the properties which I clearly and distinctly understand, that is, all those which viewed in general terms are comprised within the subject matter of pure mathematics. He confirms the same in the letter to the unknown correspondent when he says that in the case of a triangle existing outside thought, the triangle is nothing other than its essence. The something to which a clear and distinct idea of a triangle conforms is body, insofar as it has the properties that are the subject matter of pure mathematics, which is to say that the Fifth Meditation, true and immutable nature or essence of a triangle is triangularity as it exists in extension, even if we were not in a position to notice that in the Fifth Meditation. There we were only in a position to notice that the true and immutable nature of God is nothing other than God, and hence that God exists. In the Sixth Meditation, Descartes says that geometrical properties exist in extension, that extension possesses geometrical properties. But noteworthy is that he nowhere specifies exactly how it is that geometrical properties exist in extension. He doesn't get into the details. He nowhere specifies the ontology of geometrical properties completely. He is given an opportunity. Gassendi asks about this. In Fifth Objections, he's pressed on the question of the sense in which geometrical properties are manifested in extension, and he punts. What he says in Fifth Replies is that, quote, the world could undoubtedly contain figures such as those the geometrists study, but we don't know if it does, and we could never uncover them via our senses. Descartes thinks that we grasp truths about geometry, and he holds that truth is the conformity of ideas with reality, but he does not think that we're always in a position to understand the details of the ontology of the entity to which a true idea corresponds. We might be disappointed with Descartes on this count, but I actually find his view quite refreshing. It's one thing to grasp a truth, For example, that 2 and 3 add to 5, or that minds and bodies are united, or that the square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides, or that bodies are indefinitely divided, or that it's possible that things be other than they are. But it's a much different thing to ask what it is in reality in virtue of which any of these is true. And often the philosophy begins when we identify a bunch of truths and then try to figure out what it is in reality in virtue of which the truth is true. In many cases, though, the determination of the ontology of a truth maker is really hard. And in some cases, it might simply be beyond us. One more example is the relationship between divine preservation and constant creation. Famously, Descartes says that the two are the same. For example, in the third meditation, we might be tempted in the tradition of Malebranche and others to argue that what it means for Descartes to say that God preserves creatures in existence is just for God to recreate them from moment to moment. But Descartes does not hold that preservation reduces to constant creation. He says, for example, in the world, it follows of necessity from the mere fact that God continues to preserve a body, that there must be many changes in its parts which cannot, it seems to me, properly be attributed to the action of God. For Descartes, there's a power that is just as much preservation as it is recreation. Such a power is mind-boggling. Descartes nowhere provides an account of it, but to his credit, that's extremely hard to do. I don't have such an account myself. I'm not sure that anyone else does. An account of something that is both constant creation and preservation. And I would not want to critique Descartes for failing to provide an account himself if he never pretends to put one on offer. He does say in Principles 151 that a substance is something which can be said to depend on no thing whatsoever, and hence that there's a sense in which creatures are independent and a sense in which they're not. But he nowhere draws the line between recreation and preservation, and for good reason. A lot of metaphysical issues are simply beyond our reach. Descartes holds that it's true that there's a kind of creation that's nothing other than preservation, the nihil aliud quam preservation. But when we inquire into its ontology, he gives the appropriate response. He says nothing. And arguably that is to his credit. He does not report that he has an account of the activity that is both creation and preservation and ask for a drum roll and then announce with great but anticlimactic fanfare that preservation is nothing other than creation. He doesn't attempt to provide any account at all. To be sure, if Descartes promised to provide us with definite answers to metaphysical questions, then we would have a right to be disappointed with his silence, with his relative silence. But Descartes is not in the business of promising answers to metaphysical questions, not to many of them at least. Instead, he emphasizes that our metaphysical tether is very short and that there are other kinds of matter on which to focus our attention instead. He famously says to Princess Elizabeth, "I'm almost afraid that your highness may think I am now not speaking seriously, but that would go against the respect which I owe her and which I will never cease to show her. I can say with truth that the chief rule I've always observed in my studies, which I think has been the most useful in acquiring the knowledge I have, has been never to spend more than a few hours a day in the thoughts which occupy the imagination and a few hours a year on those which occupy the intellect alone. I've given all the rest of my time to the relaxation of the senses and the repose of the mind." We might suppose that Descartes just being autobiographical here and that he's merely reporting his own individual proclivities, but later in the same letter, he makes a more general statement that he takes to apply across the board. I think that's very necessary to have properly understood once in a lifetime the principles of metaphysics, since they're what gives us the knowledge of God and our soul. But I think also that it would be very harmful to occupy one's intellect frequently in meditating upon them, since this would impede it from devoting oneself to all of the functions of the imagination and senses. I think that the best thing is to content oneself with keeping in one's memory and one's belief the conclusions which one has drawn from them, and then employ the rest of one's study time to thoughts in which the intellect cooperates with the imagination and the senses. Descartes expresses the same sentiment in a later letter to Elizabeth in October 1645. There's also the 1647 interview with Franz Berman. He's reported to have said, "A point to note is that one should not devote so much effort to the meditations and to metaphysical questions, or give them elaborate treatment and commentaries and the like. Still less should one do what some try to do and dig more deeply into these questions than the author did. He's dealt with them quite deeply enough. It's sufficient to have grasped them once in a general way, than to remember the conclusion. Otherwise, they draw the mind too far away from physical and observable things and make it unfit to study them. And it's just these physical studies that it's most desirable for people to pursue, since they will yield abundant benefits for life. Descartes holds that finite human beings aren't built to do much in the way of metaphysics. Note that here I take myself to be in rough agreement with Professors Marion Garber and also Richard Watson, who famously argues in a 1984 paper that Descartes knows nothing and that he knows nothing. I don't want to go nearly as far as Watson. I think we do grasp a small number of metaphysical truths according to Descartes, but in addition, there are cases in which we grasp a truth and we're not in a position to grasp the details of the ontology of its truth maker. So now I want to return briefly to the critique of Sowell's view on the rational distinction between a substance and its attributes. A drawback of the view is that it tells us that attributes like eternality, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence are to be ascribed to God only loosely. For example, what it is to have a clear and distinct perception of God as omniscient is to arrive at a clear and distinct idea of God by way of thinking about our own finite knowledge. And so the descriptor omniscient is more about us than about God. Worry arises about the attribute of omnibenevolence in particular. Descartes needs to be able to say that God is omnibenevolent in a way that ascribes a benevolence to God. Here I've suggested a Cartesian way for Descartes to do that, even if Sowell is right that Descartes holds that a substance and its attributes are identical. He can argue that it's true that God is omnibenevolent, that God's omnipotent, and that God's omniscient. We grasp that all of these are true, and then we ask, for example, about the ontology of a kind of omnibenevolence that's identical to omniscience and omnipotence. As on most matters, Descartes is silent. We grasp a number of truths, but there's a limit to our tether. We do not understand what it is for something to be benevolence that is also omnipotence and omniscience, and so we don't say. By the same token, if we hold it for Descartes, a substance and its attributes are not identical, but that nonetheless a substance is nihil aliud quam its attributes, we do not understand what it is for something to be a benevolence that's nothing other than omnipotence and omniscience, and so we do not say. Let me conclude by pointing to another reason why it's important to be able to ascribe the divine attributes to God, not just goodness, but also omniscience, immutability, independence, and perfection. The reason is that his ethics, and more specifically his view of the good life for a human being, depends on it. It's uncontroversial that Descartes holds that God is supremely perfect. In the Meditations alone, there are more than 10 passages in which Descartes emphasizes the supreme perfection of God, and the rest of his corpus contains similar passages as well. For Descartes, there's no standard of goodness or perfection that's independent of God, of course, but the divine being is supreme perfection itself. I think that in addition, Descartes holds that God's perfection is an exemplar that serves as a guide by which finite minds might increase their own perfection. This is a controversial view, I realize, given that it's tempting to subscribe to the thesis that Descartes holds that God just arbitrarily decrees a standard of goodness. But I don't think that Descartes subscribes to that thesis, actually. A lot more needs to be said, of course, but for starters, we might note what God says about omniscience. The way to reach the love of God is to consider that he's a mind or a thing that thinks, and that our soul's nature resembles his sufficiently for us to believe that it's an emanation of his supreme intelligence, a breath of divine spirit. Our knowledge seems to be able to grow by degrees to infinity. And since God's knowledge is infinite, it's the point towards which ours strives. Descartes holds that God is the standard or exemplar of supreme perfection, and that we become more perfect to the degree that we move in the direction of the divine. As creatures of a perfect being, we already exhibit some perfection. He writes in the Meditations, the mere fact that God created me is a very strong basis for believing that I am somehow made in his image and likeness. I cannot complain that the will or freedom of choice which I receive from God is not sufficiently extensive or perfect, since I know by experience that it's not restricted in any way. It's above all in virtue of the will that I understand myself to bear in some way the image and likeness of God. Descartes holds that God creates in a way that's reflective of divine perfection. Descartes does not make beings that are wholly perfect, of course. Finite minds fall far short of God, but we can increase our perfection. For example, when, as he says, our knowledge seems to be able to grow by degrees to infinity and is the point towards which ours strives. We never become omniscient, but we can always acquire more knowledge, and we can incorporate that knowledge into firm and determinate maxims by which to avoid passions like remorse, anxiety, hate, anger, and irresolution. Descartes writes, for example, that there is nothing to repent of when we've done what we judged best at the time when we had to decide to act, even though later, thinking it over at our leisure, we judge that we made a mistake. Is that it does not belong to human nature to be omniscient or always to judge as well on the spur of the moment as when there is plenty of time to deliberate. We become more perfect as we increase our knowledge, and through our adherence to firm and determinate maxims, we become more immutable and more independent. Descartes indeed says in Passions 3:152 that to become more independent of our passions and our bodily states renders us in a certain way like God by making us masters of ourselves. The Passions of the Soul is then a guidebook for helping us to become more independent, more active, and as he says to Princess Elizabeth, more happy and content. We move up the scale of being that Descartes references in the fourth meditation. I possess not only a real and positive idea of God or a being who's supremely perfect, but also what may be described as a negative idea of nothingness or of that which is farthest removed from perfection. I realize that I am, as it were, something intermediate between God and nothingness, or between supreme being and non-being. Here, Descartes identifies being and perfection. In other texts, he identifies being and goodness. He speaks interchangeably of non-being, non-good, or non-true, and says that these three things are the same, for example, in a letter to Clercellier. Being at the highest level is perfection, and being that scales from nothingness to perfection is good to its proportional degree. Finite minds are not perfect, Descartes rightly supposes, but they participate in perfection in the sense that they are somewhere on the spectrum of nothingness to supreme being. Descartes holds that it's true that God is supremely perfect, and that it is true that God is omnibenevolent. If a substance is nihil aliud quam its attributes in reality, then the omnibenevolence of God is a kind of omnibenevolence that is nihil aliud quam omniscience and omnipotence and supreme perfection. We may not understand the ontology of such a feature, but Descartes holds that when it comes to metaphysical matters, there's very little that we understand. Our candle shines brightly enough for us to attend to matters that are far more important. We spend maybe a couple hours per year engaging in abstract metaphysical inquiry, and the rest of our time is devoted to increasing our perfection in the context of embodiment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you both speakers for these wonderful talks. We have time for questions. Please either write in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, I think Marlene Rosamond has a question.
Hi, I've been thinking about some of this stuff in relation to Suarez, as Andrea and David both know. And some of my questions come out of Suarez. So here are, so I'm on the Kaufman side of the debate, the identity of substance and attributes. Andrea talked about principles, the passage in the Principles where Descartes seems to identify substance and attribute, but a passage that I would have in mind is in the comments on a certain broadsheet, where he says that thought is the principal attribute of mind and extension is the principal attribute of body. And then he writes, and this is apparently a comment on the Principles, he said, but I did not say that these attributes are present in the substances as in subjects distinct from them. So that I find an even more powerful passage that may support the identity thesis. I also, about, you both cited this letter, so I was wondering what you think about that passage, but I also wondered about that letter to an unknown correspondent that you both cited, because I may be confused, but I felt like it was being cited on both sides of the debate. So Descartes says in this letter that he only accepts a distinctio ratio kinatae. This language always drives me a little bit up the wall, but oh well. And then he says, so there must be a distinction in the world, in reality. And then he says, as you pointed out, he says essence and existence is something are in no way distinct. But then he says the foundation in reality is when I say Peter is a man, the thought by which I think of Peter differs mostly from the thought by which I think of man. But in Peter himself, being a man is nothing other than being Peter. So that sounds like he's saying that in Peter, there's no distinction at all. The distinction is just between the modes and the mind. Now, I completely agree with David's reaction that seems weird, because it seems to really reduce the two distinctions of reason to each other, like it's just in the mind. But thinking about Suarez and in response to what you're saying today, I thought, well, maybe there's this. So Suarez says that a distinctio ratio kinantis, which is a purely mental distinction, is when you say Peter is Peter. So you repeat the same concept. But when you're talking, when you have a distinctio ratio kinatae, he says, it's not in the thing that you're talking about. Instead, it's something in reality. And Suarez doesn't talk about thoughts in your mind. He talks about how God's attributes, for instance, are distinct in virtue of the different effects that they produce in the world. Or we think of them as distinct from each other because we think of them in analogy with our own properties. So Suarez's distinctio ratio kinatae is not in the thing itself, but in other aspects of reality. And I think I now see maybe a way in which Descartes could save the distinction between the two types by saying one of them is when you think Peter is Peter, which was Suarez's example, and the other one is when you say Peter is a man, and then you have two different concepts in your mind, whereas in the thing itself, there is no distinction, which I think he's really saying there. So I just wondered about your reaction to those two texts.
Okay.
Andrea, do you want to go?
Well, I have never read Suarez, I'm afraid, but with regard to the first citation, I think, Marilyn, you made from, is it the comments on a certain broadsheet? Did you say that Descartes says that the thought and extension are in a subject, but not distinct from that subject, something like that? I take that to mean that there is no real distinction between the thought and extension in the substances themselves. In other words, thought and extension cannot be separated and exist independently of the substance, rather than saying they are identical because they're not distinct. That's how I understand that passage. So I think if that's the case, then maybe it's ambiguous. But he just says distinct from without saying anything else. It seems to me he has in mind a real distinction, that the two can exist independently. But I don't know, David, are you familiar with that passage?
Well, I as I was working on my paper and reading through the text, I kept thinking, honestly, I kept thinking, what would the great Paul Hoffman say about some of these passages? And I suspect that when Descartes says in the letter to the unknown correspondent, for example, that existence and essence are in no way distinct, I think that Paul would go back to the third meditation language about the inseparability and interconnectedness of the attributes, and say that in no way distinct means something like in no way separable, along the lines that Andrea is suggesting. And so that maybe that's a way to read the passage in the comments on a certain broadsheet. I think, so it's really interesting, Marlene. I've been trying to find a way to read the two parts of the letter to the unknown correspondent so that they express a single view. And I do worry, right, that so that there's the passage where he says that essence and existence are in no way distinct. And but then there's that could be inseparable if someone wanted to argue it. But then there's the language nihil aliud quam, is nothing other than. that seems harder to read as inseparable. And so then I look at the passages that Sowell and Nolan and Nelson cite around the identity of the attributes of God, for example. And I think, okay, we can take this. They can take this nihil aliud quam as meaning that Descartes is putting forward the identity thesis. But then I worry about the ratio sonantis passage, and I've also been trying to find a way, Marlene, to read it along the lines you've been reading it. I find it difficult, but I'm trying, because he does say in some passages that the attributes of God are identical, for example. So it's important to try to make it all fit together. But then I still worry about second replies in the More Geometrico. Those texts that Andrea cited, I cited one of them. They seem to put attributes and substance on a different ontological plane. And I think that's why I was a little cagey in my paper. I didn't come down on one side. I see Descartes in a way as struggling with this really hard metaphysical issue. And I think that he's trying to get at the ontology of substances and attributes. And it's so hard to know what to say. And he's almost sort of getting at it, but every time he gets close, it's ephemeral. And that's one of the reasons I cited some of these passages about the limits to doing metaphysics and the limits of our tether. I wonder if, rather than see his kind of wavering in second replies on the one hand and some of the other passages on the other, if instead he's really looking at this metaphysical issue and thinking, what do we say here? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I suspect that this is going to be a very Garberian comment, contrary to Garber just going against me. Anyway, but I'm not convinced that in the geometrical that Descartes is using the terms in the technical senses that he distinguishes in the principles, right? And that seems important. And yeah, Dan says, I'm not sure Descartes read that disputation, at least very carefully. That may, whatever, I don't know what Descartes read exactly, but when I read Suarez, it so helps me understand Descartes. It's just incredible. It's an incredibly rich disputation. It's got a lot more to say, and it really helps get Descartes out of various kinds of trouble also philosophically. So I continue, in spite of Dan's pushback, to recommend that anybody who thinks about distinctions in Descartes read Suarez's disputation. And it's very short, unlike almost all of the other disputations in Suarez, and it exists in English. There, that's my pitch for Suarez.
Right, thank you. Noah has also a question. Noah Shine.
Thank you. This was fantastic. I have a question, I think, for each. Dave, I'm wondering a little bit with your suggestion about that we can know that something is true, but yet not know the metaphysical groundings. I'm wondering if that wouldn't suddenly make the philosopher too close to the atheist geometer who knows certain truths, but somehow lacks knowing why they're true. So I'm a little like, I like where you're going, but I'm a little worried.
No, it's awkward. I think on this sort of reading, you've got to say things like that. For Descartes, we grasp the truth that God is omnibenevolent and is not a deceiver. And that's enough to block the potential objection. Well, what if God deceived us about matters that are utterly evident to us? But then if we ask the further question, what's the ontology of the goodness of God? Then we get into really murky waters. It's a kind of goodness that's somehow identical or nothing other than, right? Just to straddle the fence a little bit. It's nothing other than omniscience, omnipotence. If we really try to understand the property, I think we run into trouble. But I think I would have to say that Descartes thinks we understand it enough in order to be able to block the objection that God might be deceiving us. I mean, he seems to think we grasp the truth that God is good. He mentions that, in a bunch of places. But he also seems to think God's incomprehensible, right?
well, you don't know him like he knows himself. Right, would be, but it's still
I guess, sorry. I guess Descartes never says that we have adequate ideas of anything. We have clear and distinct ideas, which means that we cannot grasp the totality of truths, but whatever we can understand clearly and distinctly does not fall short of what is true. And he has a nice distinction between we do not have complete knowledge of anything, even of ourselves, but we have knowledge that it is complete. So we have knowledge that we are complete entities. We have knowledge that God is complete, but we don't have complete knowledge of God or of us or anything else. So it's not that clear and distinct ideas fall short of the truth. It's just that they cannot give us the totality of truth. That's how I understand that distinction that he draws.
I think the question I wanted to ask you, Andrea, is the following. Descartes says that to know a substance, we have to know it via an attribute, but he makes the point that we can't know substance on its own, right? Yes. But then if we go along with the non-identity kind of interpretation, then it seems that a clear and distinct idea of an attribute, a divine attribute, isn't a clear and distinct perception of God's perfection, completeness, unity. That's exactly sort of what would be missing in the perception via an attribute. But then it seems that we can't know that, right? That then this important thing that is grounding the whole picture, the unity and simplicity, sort of in principle, something very important that we can't know, right? And then why not think that each attribute is a different substance, right? Spinoza has a great solution for this because he shows I can't be thinking all the different substances, right? Whenever I'm thinking the one, but Descartes can't exactly do that, right? So it's like the unity is not something I can know.
Sorry, did you say distinct substances? Did you mean attributes?
Well, the distinct attributes, right? We're saying they're distinct attributes of a single substance because there's this assumption of the unity of substance. But I don't see how, on Descartes' view, if we go along with the non-identity interpretation, that is something that we can at all know. It would be something that we accept. Like this really fundamental feature of the metaphysics is something that we're going to have to accept on something like faith, which that seems to be uncomfortable.
But I guess given that the attributes are not separable, there is this distinction. In other words, you're able to distinguish that this is an attribute of omniscience or an attribute of omnipotence, but they're not discrete in the sense that they can be separated. So understanding that it is omnipotent, you understand that it is omniscient, and you can understand that there is a unity because they are inseparable, those attributes. And the unity, their unity, is presupposed by the unity of substance. The unity of substance is prior to the unity of anything else. So we can understand that there is unity even if we cannot grasp it, as it were. And this is what he says indeed about God, that we cannot grasp it, but we can understand it. So it seems to me, I don't see that there is, it might be difficult, but I don't see that it is really committing him to say, therefore, all the attributes are identical. But then if they're all identical, is there a single one that belongs to God? Or just God reduces to the attributes and has a kind of reductive account? Is God a collection of attributes, or are they all? I don't see that that's help us in any way.
Mm.
Because if we take the notion of union or unity as a basic and fundamental notion that belongs to substances, because substances cannot not be a unity, then that unity of God, of the substance, the infinite substance, is presupposed in the unity of the attributes. And of course, we don't have an understanding of all the infinity of attributes of God, only a very small number. I don't know whether that's any helpful or.
It's helpful. And just my computer beeped that I'm running slow on power, so I don't want to be. I don't want to cut everything in the middle.
Noah, can I say
And
one
so-
more thing in response to your
Yes.
question? It's that I think that whichever view somebody accepts, there's going to be a tricky issue around attributing goodness to God, because if you think that there are no relata in God, there's no sort of goodness, omniscience, etc., then it's not clear that what you're attributing to God when you say that God is good.
Mhm.
And then if on the other hand you think that the attributes of God are inseparable, or you have a view where they're not identical, then I think you're going to want to say things like that God has the attribute of goodness, God has the attribute of omniscience, etc. But then if you're asked, well, tell me more about each of those, Descartes' answer is going to be, well, each of them is inseparable from the other. They're so tightly interconnected that it's a kind of omniscience or omnibenevolence that's intermingled with or somehow interconnected with omnibenevolence and omniscience. It's not clear that we're understanding what that is either. I don't think. I think Descartes' view is pretty clear. We don't understand that. And so I think he better say that it's enough that we grasp the truth that God is good in order to get us past certain epistemological problems.
Dan Garber.
Thank you very much, both of you, for really, really interesting talks. I would like to make sort of a couple of observations and ask what is the question. First of all, to Marlene, I didn't mean that to be an attack on you. I think there really is a serious question about and discussion in the literature about how much Descartes really remembered, how much he learned about serious scholastic metaphysics when he was at school. Would you give a 15-year-old Suarez to read? I'm not sure you would, but in any case, and how much he would have remembered of that later. I mean, think, for example, of the discussion of modal distinction in the first replies that he has to take back later in Principles, Part 1, Section 32, or Section 62. So obviously I have the feeling that for some of these things, he looked them up as he needed them when they came up in, for example, the objections and replies when he was composing the principles, but that he was not. Descartes didn't like to read other people, and I think particularly scholastic metaphysics. But that's sort of a larger question. David, at the end of your talk, you talked about God as an exemplar for Descartes, and I wonder about that. What about properties like attributes like immutability, which are quite central for Descartes' physics? Do we really want to become immutable and constant in the way in which God is? And as far as infinity goes, certainly we would like to learn more and more. But in the third Meditations, Descartes distinguishes very carefully the kind of increase in knowledge that we can hope for from the kind of infinity that we attribute to God, which he says quite clearly is something very different. We can't get the idea of God's infinity from thinking of the increase in knowledge. It's something that we can only get directly from God. That's part of the argument. But I just wanted to also point out, I have a question about the identity, about the relationship between attributes and God, between the attributes and substance in God versus the relationship between the attributes and substance in finite things. That is worth pointing out. I know it isn't exactly sort of the central theme, but one of the things that I find very striking about Descartes' account of the attributes when we're talking about finite substances is basically the identity of the attribute and the substance. This is Principles Part 1, Section 63. Thought and extension can be regarded as constituting the natures of intelligent substance and corporeal substance. They must be considered as nothing else but thinking substance itself and extended substance itself, that is mind and body, which is to say for finite things, it's not like we're talking about substance as substratum in which there is thought or in which there is extension, but that the two of them have substance in common. Mind is thought substantialized. Body is extension substantialized. Do we want to say the same about the attributes of God and God? Or is there a difference between the way in which substance and attributes are related to one another in finite substance and in God?
Let me say something in response to the end of the first part of your question. I know that was directed specifically at some of the things I had said. And then maybe Andrea and I can each say something about the second part. What I want to say is that certainly we never would become infinite and never become perfect. But I think there's a theme. I'm not a Leibniz scholar in anything like the way that I take myself, at least, to be a Descartes scholar, but the language in Leibniz of increasing our perfection. I think there's room for a philosopher in the 17th century to talk about moving in the direction of perfection, even if we're never going to get to infinity, but to see it as a kind of guidepost. And my speculation is that because there's been a tendency to read Descartes as holding that God is the sort of free and arbitrary cause of everything, including the definition of goodness or the standards of goodness, then his ethics doesn't have a whole lot going for it if it's just kind of made up. And so I think his view isn't that. I think his view is that no, there's such a thing as goodness and there's such a thing as perfection, and we can move in the direction of it with God as a kind of model, even if we can never get there. I think that so the omniscience passage, the breath of divine spirit passage, I think does a good job of capturing that view or reflecting that view. I think immutability, though, right? I think that Descartes does think there's a way in which immutability is, there's a version of immutability that a finite mind can try to approach. And that's in this language he uses around arriving at firm and determinate judgments. He talks a lot about the individual who becomes discombobulated and shaken by remorse and other kinds of emotions or anxiety. He talks about the individual who is enslaved by their passions and who's pulled to and fro. I think there's a kind of version of unflappability, a finite kind of unflappability that is one of the goals that a person would seek to acquire by working through the passion. I think Descartes sees that as a good end. And I think it's related to, it's not divine immutability, of course, but I think the unflappability that you get when you acquire more knowledge and adhere to firm and determinate maxims is a way of moving in the direction of perfection. And I think he thinks a human being can move quite a ways in that direction and become more perfect.
I mean, that's absolutely so. I mean, it's a sort of Stoic constancy.
Yeah.
I think that Descartes is talking about. There's no question about that. But one of the things that is radically different between us as finite things and God is the causa secundum esse of everything, all of the finite things in the world. And it's in that connection that his immutability comes up. And that is just so far of anything that, well, it's not Stoic constancy. It is something I think that is, only God can aspire, well, not aspire to that. It's only relevant, I think, when you're talking about, an infinite being who is the foundation of everything in the world, the causal foundation of everything in the world.
What if I put it in terms of independence? Would that make a difference? I know God's the only perfectly independent being, but I think that Descartes would say that if we took seriously some of the guidance in the passions of the soul and use some of the tools that he puts forward, we would become more independent beings. We would become, I think he would say, more free beings. I wonder.
It's worth certainly the idea of God. Certainly the idea of Christ as a model is something that there is a way in which it's true. There are but I was just thinking about various attributes, and that God has, that it would be inappropriate to think that we can even aspire to emulate. But that was just sort of something to throw out, to sort of think about, a little bit more in the way in which the comment to Marlene is really a question to think about what what Descartes may have known and what he did.
Yeah, thank you.
Not really a direct assertion. But the other question I have is also what do you think about that distinction between the attribute-substance relation in us and the attribute-substance relation in God, or the attribute-substance relation in finite substances, and the attribute-substance relation in God?
Is that a question for me? Yeah, Andrea, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't know. Is it for me?
It's for
Is it a
anybody
question
who would like
for
to
anyone?
think about
Yeah.
that.
The passage on Principles 163 is the one that I discussed in my paper. And I did say that the way I see it is Descartes now, I saw it as his attempt to get his correspondents and objectors to understand that he no longer holds the idea that substance is a composite. And it seems to me, in order to get his point across, he is led to say that extension and substance, he doesn't say they're identical, but they are, let me get the, Oh,
What he
he
does
doesn't
say is,
say that he doesn't say they are identical, but they be considered as nothing else. And is that being considered as nothing else that makes me think that he doesn't want to say they're identical, but he wants to say at the same time that they're not separable. That's how I read that passage 163.
well, if you look earlier in 162,
Yes.
the beginning, what he says is that there's a distinction of reason. There's only a distinction of reason
But
between.
which distinction of reason does he accept? That, I guess that's the debate, isn't it? Whether he accepts reason, distinction ratio synandis, without a foundation in reality, or distinction ratio synate, which has a foundation in reality. So it seems that
I'm
these are
not
the
sure
things
he
that,
recognizes a difference between them. And this gets back to the question with Marlene. I'm not sure that he has that sophisticated a view.
why does he say I do not recognize? He does explicitly states that I do not recognize, he says, a distinction without a foundation in reality. So why would he say that if he thought that they were the same, that there was no distinction between the two distinctions, as it were? He rejects one and accepts the other, and he works with the second rather than the first. So I don't think there is a difference with regard to the distinction in the attributes and the infinite substance, and the distinction in finite substances and attributes. And he does say they constitute the essence of corporeal substance and mental substance. Well, if they were identical, how can they constitute the essence?
Well, let me just read the beginning of 63. Thought and extension can be regarded as constituting the natures of intelligent substance and corporeal substance. They must then be considered as nothing else but the attributes. Thought and extension can be considered nothing else but thinking substance itself, an extended substance itself, that is mind and body.
That's right. That's I had the full quotation in the paper, and
but still, doesn't that suggest the identity of the two?
Well, in one sense, I guess it suggests that, but in another sense, is as I said, that there isn't really a real distinction between substance and attribute, in the sense that they then come together, these really distinct things, distinct as in a real distinction, like mind and body, that they are really distinct, because a real distinction for Descartes holds only between complete entities. A conceptual distinction holds between incomplete and complete entities, and indeed between the incomplete entities themselves. So if we think of Aristotelian conception, there is substantial form, and then there is matter, which is prime matter, unspecified or whatever, and then they come together and form this composite. I think this is what Descartes is trying to say, that I no longer hold that view. That's how I see that passage.
But that he no longer holds the view as one being the substantial form, and the other being the material.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
no, of course he doesn't want
the prime matter, are you suggesting? But
right.
Sorry, I think I
He does not want to hold that view. But then I'm not sure what view you think he does want to hold.
I'm sorry, he does think what? I'm sorry.
No, I'm not sure that I understand what view it is that he does want to hold in that passage?
I think the view that he holds is his new conception of what substance is and what makes substance what it is. And he wants to say it's not the substantial form that makes substance what
Right.
it is, but he introduces this notion of attribute, which is, I guess, in one way to demonstrate that he no longer holds the view of substantial forms. And he introduces the notion of attribute. And I think, as I said, it's another way of rejecting the universals of the dialecticians, as he says. For Descartes, we have the simple common notions, which are simple and basic, and the direction of reasoning that he introduces here is that we see in the single notion, we see in the particular the universal, rather than going from the universal to the particular. That's the direction of reasoning that Descartes has by rejecting the universals of the dialecticians, because he says they are constructs of reason. And even if they're useful for practical purposes, for human beings to make sense of the empirical world around them, that's okay, but that's not useful for metaphysics. In metaphysics, we begin with the simple notions and understand the general. And similarly, for all the principles, they are formed from the particular and you go to the general. So that's how I see that direction of reasoning that he has there.
And I think I agree with you. But the way in which you look at it may be just a little bit different. What I see going on there is, mind is thought made real, made concrete in a way, and body is extension made real, made concrete in a way, and that is going to be the particular from which one can derive, as it were, the universal. Is that the sort of thing that you have in mind?
Well, the sort of thing I have in mind is that you have the notion of extension, and from that, you can then begin to understand what follows from that, the shape, the size, the movement, and so on of any particular body. Similarly, with regard to the mind, when he says the acts of the mind, they all include, in their essential definition, an act of the intellect. In other words, they're all modes under the attribute of thought. And in that he includes, and this is what I see, another way of moving away from Aristotle's division between the sensory soul and nous, the intellectual mind. And Descartes includes in that category of the acts of the mind that they all include an intellectual act in their essential definition. I see that because he includes perception, sensory, sensations, emotions, and the whole list that he gives, each one of them. In other words, he unites the mind now, and they all fall under the single attribute of thought. So we see the general in the simple single attribute of thought.
Yeah.
That's how I read him in every stage that he moves in whatever he's doing there. That reversal of the order of reasoning. And I think he makes it clear that he follows the order of reasoning. He says, not the order of the subject matter. I think he writes that to Mersenne. We need, and the order of discovery for Descartes follows the order of reasoning. So from these simple notions, we then begin to understand the general. maybe I don't know. That's how
Oh, thank you. Thank you
I-
very much.
Well, we are sort of approaching the end. If there is any pressing question, any conclusion, or Dolores?
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on one point, Andrea, that you made, which is if you see Aristotle as the opponent of Descartes, and you're collapsing all of the, as it were, parts of the soul in Aristotle that are used in not only in thought but in perception, then is there either there's no problem at all about how the mind and the body work, because if you actually have to have sense organs in order to have sense perception to be able to as in de anima, you need sense perception even to see, thought thinking itself requires sense perception. So what's the problem with the body then? Because doesn't that bring in the body by the back door?
I'm not sure. What do you mean the problem with the body?
Well, because I mean, perhaps this is a naive view, but I mean, most people think Descartes has a problem making arguments about the mind-body problem, that just with the traditional way of reading Descartes, it's not clear that the body is necessary.
Necessary for what?
For necessary for perceiving simples.
No, if those are intellectual notions. So you can understand extension thought, you can understand this, what he distinguishes in the reguli, the intellectual simple notions and the corporeal simple notions that pertain independently to each one of the two substances. And then he talks about the simple common notions that they are attributed, they're ascribable, he says, indifferently to both corporeal and mental substances. So for example, existence, duration, and the like, he says in the reguli, they can all be, and union, they cannot be applied to both. But then he distinguishes, as I said, between the intellectual notions and the extended notions. But in the case of, if we're thinking about, say, the second meditation, where Descartes there, I see Descartes as anticipating Frege's distinction. Frege distinguishes between the act of thought and the content of thought. And that's exactly what I see in the second meditation, where Descartes says that I am seeing, that I am sensing, that cannot be doubted. But what I'm sensing at that stage of the meditations can be doubted. So the content then of my perception, sensory perception, intellectual perception, and so on, are objective, and they can be subject to doubt. But that I'm actively sensing or perceiving, that cannot be doubted. So this is where you get the unity of the acts of the mind, as distinct from Aristotle, of course, never thought that nous was a composite. On the contrary, nous was pure intellect, and indeed is the only part in us that he states categorically that is eternal and immortal. At least with Descartes, we get only the possibility of the immortality of the soul, but Aristotle states it categorically in Book 3 of the De Anima. So there is what I call this sharp division in Aristotle, and Descartes tries to unite the two, despite the fact that he still distinguishes between the intellectual and the sensory, but they all belong to the mind, and they all fall under the attribute of thought. I don't know whether this helps in any way.
Thanks
with
for
regard to,
clarifying. Yeah.
thank you. With regard to the mind-body problem, I don't think Descartes ever thought that there was a mind-body problem. Because he didn't, I mean, his causal principle is neutral with regard to the causal relata. He didn't think that this causal principle that we have in the 20th and 21st century that is physically closed and so on, and no interaction can happen if it's not physically between two physical things. Descartes never thought that. That's not his causal principle. So he didn't, as far as I can tell, he didn't think there was a mind-body problem. And in any case, it's not the interaction in Descartes that brings the unity of a human being. The unity is presupposed by the interaction. There could not be interaction if there was no unity for Descartes. And it's that famous line 81 in Meditation 6, where he says, if that were the case, we would be pilots in ships and have completely an objective understanding of the damage on the body without feeling any sensation. So the interaction presupposes the union for Descartes, and then the interaction happens. But I guess these are difficult and complex issues that need quite a lot of discussion and so on. But I don't know whether...
Probably we need another session for these issues.
Yeah.
Another session of the Princeton-Bucharest seminar. We have to stop here. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, David. This was a wonderful session. Thank you all for attending it and for the discussions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. It was great to see you all.
Let's hope
Thank
that we are going to see each other next week.